which the term is used by bourgeois and petty bourgeois ideologists, the anarchists among the latter. His idea of centralism did not in the least preclude such broad local self-government as would combine the voluntary defense of the unity of the states by the communes and districts, and the complete elimination of all bureaucratic practices and all ordering from above. Carrying forward the program views of Marxism on the state, Engels wrote, quote, "So then a unified republic, but not in the sense of the present French Republic, which is nothing but the empire established in 1798 without the emperor. From 1792 to 1798, each French department, each commune, enjoyed complete self-government on the American model, and this is what we too must have. How self-government is to be organized, and how we can manage without a bureaucracy, has been shown to us by America and the First French Republic, and is being shown even today by Australia, Canada, and the other English colonies. And a provincial, regional, and communal self-government of this type is far freer than, for instance, Swiss federalism, under which it is true the canton is very independent in relation to the Bund, i.e. the federated state as a whole, but is also independent in relation to the district and the commune. The cantonal governments appoint the district governors and prefects, which is unknown in English-speaking countries, and which we want to abolish here as resolutely in the future as the Prussian Landrate and Regierungsrate, commissioners, district police chiefs, governors, and in general all officials appointed from above. Accordingly, Engels proposes the following words for the self-government clauses in the program, quote, "Complete self-government for the provinces, gubernias or regions, districts and communes through officials elected by universal suffrage, the abolition of all local and provincial authorities appointed by the state," unquote. I have already had occasion to point out in Pravda number 68, which was suppressed by the government of Kerensky and other socialist quote-unquote ministers, how on this point, of course, not on this point alone by any means, our pseudo-socialist representatives of pseudo-revolutionary pseudo-democracy have made glaring departures from democracy. Naturally, people who have bound themselves by a coalition to the imperialist bourgeoisie have remained deaf to this criticism. It is extremely important to note that Engels, armed with facts, disproved by a most precise example the prejudice which is very widespread, particularly among petty bourgeois Democrats, that a federal republic necessarily means a greater amount of freedom than a centralized republic. This is wrong. It is disproved by the facts cited by Engels regarding the centralized French Republic of 1792 to 98 and the federal Swiss Republic. The really democratic centralized republic gave more freedom than the federal republic. In other words, the greatest amount of local, regional, and other freedom known in history was accorded by a centralized and not a federal republic. Insufficient attention has been and is being paid in our party propaganda and agitation to this fact, as indeed to the whole question of the federal and the centralized republic and local self-government. Beginning of a new header, the 1891 preface to Marx's The Civil War in France. In his preface to the third edition of The Civil War in France, this preface is dated March 18, 1891, and was originally published in Neue Zeit, Engels, in addition to some interesting incidental remarks on questions concerning the attitude towards the state, gave a remarkably vivid summary of the lessons of the Commune. This summary, made more profound by the entire experience of the 20 years that separated the author from the Commune, and directed expressly against the, quote, superstitious belief in the state so widespread in Germany, may justly be called the last word of Marxism on the question under consideration. In France, Engels observed, the workers emerged with arms from every revolution. Quote, therefore, the disarming of the workers was the first commandment for the bourgeois, who were at the helm of the state. Hence, after every revolution won by the workers, a new struggle, ending with the defeat of the workers, unquote. This summary of the experience of bourgeois revolutions is as concise as it is expressive. The essence of the matter, among other things, on the question of the state has the oppressed class arms, is here remarkably well grasped. It is precisely this essence that is most often evaded by both professors influenced by bourgeois ideology and by petty bourgeois Democrats. In the Russian Revolution of 1917, the honor of blabbing this secret of bourgeois revolutions fell to the Menshevik, would-be Marxist Tseretelli. In his historic speech of June 11, Tseretelli blurted out that the bourgeoisie were determined to disarm the Petrograd workers, presenting, of course, this decision as his own and as a necessity for the state in general. Tseretelli's historic speech of June 11 will, of course, serve every historian of the Revolution of 1917 as a graphic illustration of how the social revolutionary and Menshevik bloc, led by Mr. Tseretelli, deserted to the bourgeoisie against the revolutionary proletariat. Another incidental remark of Engels, also connected with the question of the state, deals with religion. It is well known that the German Social Democrats, as they degenerated and became increasingly opportunist, slipped more and more frequently into the Philistine misinterpretation of the celebrated formula, quote, religion is to be declared a private matter. That is, the formula was twisted to mean that religion was a private matter even for the party of the revolutionary proletariat. It was against this complete betrayal of the revolutionary program of the proletariat that Engels vigorously protested. In 1891, he saw only the very feeble beginnings of opportunism in his party, and therefore he expressed himself with extreme caution. Quote, as almost only workers, or recognized representatives of the workers, sat in the Commune, its decisions bore a decidedly proletarian character. Either they decreed reforms which the Republican bourgeoisie had failed to pass solely out of cowardice, but which provided a necessary basis for the free activity of the working class, such as the realization of the principle that in relation to the state, religion is a purely private matter, or the Commune promulgated decrees which were in the direct interest of the working class, and in part cut deeply into the old order of society, unquote. Engels deliberately emphasized the words, in relation to the state, as a straight thrust at German opportunism, which had declared religion to be a private matter in relation to the party, thus degrading the party of the revolutionary proletariat to the level of the most vulgar, free-thinking Philistinism, which is prepared to allow a non-denominational status, but which renounces the party struggle against the opium of religion which stupefies the people. The future historian of the German Social Democrats, in tracing the roots of their shameful bankruptcy in 1914, will find a fair amount of interesting material on this question, beginning with the evasive declarations in the articles of the party's ideological leader, Kautsky, which throw the door wide open to opportunism, and ending with the attitude of the party towards the Los von Kirche Bewegung, the Leave the Church movement, in 1913. But let us see how, 20 years after the Commune, Engels summed up its lessons for the fighting proletariat. Here are the lessons to which Engels attached prime importance. Quote, it was precisely the oppressing power of the former centralized government, army, political parties, bureaucracy, which Napoleon had created in 1798, and which every new government had since then taken over as a welcome instrument and used against its opponents. It was this power which was to fall everywhere, just as it had fallen in Paris. Quote, from the very outset, the Commune had to recognize that the working class, once in power, could not go on managing with the old state machine, that in order not to lose again its only just gained supremacy, this working class must, on the one hand, do away with all the old machinery of oppression previously used against it itself, and on the other, safeguard itself against its own deputies and officials by declaring them all, without exception, subject to recall at any time, unquote. Engels emphasized once again that not only under a monarchy, but also under a democratic republic, the state remains a state, i.e., it retains its fundamental distinguishing feature of transforming the officials, the servants of society, its organs, into the masters of society. Quote, against this transformation of the state, and the organs of the state from servants of society into masters of society, an inevitable transformation in all previous states. The Commune used two infallible means. In the first place, it filled all posts, administrative, judicial, and educational, by election on the basis of universal suffrage of all concerned, subject to recall at any time by the electors. And, in the second place, it paid all officials, high or low, only the wages received by other workers. The highest salary paid by the Commune to anyone was 6,000 francs. In this way, a dependable barrier to place hunting and careerism was set up, even apart from the binding mandates to delegates to representative bodies, which were added besides." Unquote. Engels here approached the interesting boundary line at which consistent democracy, on the one hand, is transformed into socialism, and on the other demands socialism. For in order to abolish the state, it is necessary to convert the functions of the civil service into the simple operations of control and accounting that are within the scope and ability of the vast majority of the population, and subsequently of every single individual. And if careerism is to be abolished completely, it must be made impossible for honorable, though profitless posts in the civil service to be used as a springboard to highly lucrative posts in banks or joint stock companies, as constantly happens in all the freest capitalist countries. Engels, however, did not make the mistake some Marxists make in dealing, for example, with the question of the right of nations to self-determination, when they argue that it is impossible under capitalism and will be superfluous under socialism. This seemingly clever but actually incorrect statement might be made in regard to any democratic institution, including moderate salaries for officials, because fully consistent democracy is impossible under capitalism, and under socialism, all democracy will wither away. This is a sophism like the old joke about a man becoming bald by losing one more hair. To develop democracy to the utmost, to find the forms for this development, to test them by practice, and so forth, all this is one of the component tasks of the struggle for the social revolution. Taken separately, no kind of democracy will bring socialism. But in actual life, democracy will never be taken separately. It will be taken together with other things. It will exert its influence on economic life as well, will stimulate its transformation, and in its turn will be influenced by economic development, and so on. This is the dialectics of living history. Engels continued, quote, "This shattering of the former state power and its replacement by a new and truly democratic one is described in detail in the third section of The Civil War. But it was necessary to touch briefly here once more on some of its features, because in Germany particularly, the superstitious belief in the state has passed from philosophy into the general consciousness of the bourgeoisie and even of many workers. According to the philosophical conception, the state is the realization of the idea, or the kingdom of God on earth, translated into philosophical terms, the sphere in which eternal truth and justice are or should be realized. And from this follows a superstitious reverence for the state and everything connected with it, which takes root the more readily since people are accustomed from childhood to imagine that the affairs and interests common to the whole of society could not be looked after other than as they have been looked after in the past, that is, through the state and its lucratively positioned officials. And people think that they have taken quite an extraordinary bold step forward when they have rid themselves of belief in hereditary monarchy and swear by the democratic republic. In reality, however, the state is nothing but a machine for the oppression of one class by another, and indeed, in the democratic republic, no less than in the monarchy. And at best, it is an evil inherited by the proletariat after its victorious struggle for class supremacy, whose worst sides the victorious proletariat will have to lop off as speedily as possible, just as the Commune had to, until a generation reared in new, free social conditions is able to discard the entire lumber of the state." Unquote. Engels warned the Germans not to forget the principles of socialism with regard to the state in general, in connection with the substitution of a republic for the monarchy. His warnings now read like a veritable lesson to the Tseretellis and Chernovs, who in their coalition practice have revealed a superstitious belief in and a superstitious reverence for the state. Two more remarks. 1. Engels' statement that in a democratic republic, no less than in a monarchy, the state remains, quote, a machine for the oppression of one class by another, by no means signifies that the form of oppression makes no difference to the proletariat, as some anarchists, quote, teach. A wider, freer, and more open form of the class struggle and of class oppression vastly assists the proletariat in its struggle for the abolition of classes in general. 2. Why will only a new generation be able to discard the entire lumber of the state? This question is bound up with that of overcoming democracy, with which we shall deal now. New heading, Engels on the Overcoming of Democracy. Engels came to express his views on this subject when establishing that the term social democrat was scientifically wrong. In a preface to an edition of his articles of the 70s on various subjects, mostly on, quote, international questions, dated January 3, 1894, i.e. written a year and a half before his death, Engels wrote that in all his articles he used the word communist and not social democrat, because at that time the Proudhonists in France and the Lassalleans in Germany called themselves social democrats. Quote, for Marx and myself, continued Engels, it was therefore absolutely impossible to use such a loose term to characterize our special point of view. Today, things are different, and the word social democrat may perhaps pass muster, inexact though it still is for a party whose economic program is not merely socialist in general, but downright communist, and whose ultimate political aim is to overcome the whole state, and consequently democracy as well. The names of real political parties, however, are never wholly appropriate. The party develops while the name stays, unquote. The dialectician Engels remained true to dialectics to the end of his days. Marx and I, he said, had a splendid, scientifically exact name for the party, but there was no real party, i.e., no mass proletarian party. Now, at the end of the 19th century, there was a real party, but its name was scientifically wrong. Never mind, it would pass muster so long as the party developed, so long as the scientific inaccuracy of the name was not hidden from it and did not hinder its development in the right direction. Perhaps some wit would console us Bolsheviks in the manner of Engels. We have a real party. It is developing splendidly. Even such a meaningless and ugly term as Bolshevik will pass muster, although it expresses nothing whatsoever but the purely accidental fact that at the Brussels-London Congress of 1903, we were in the majority. Perhaps now that the persecution of our party by Republicans and, quote, revolutionary petty bourgeois Democrats in July and August has earned the name Bolshevik such universal respect, now that, in addition, this persecution marks the tremendous historical progress our party has made in its real development, perhaps now even I might hesitate to insist on the suggestion I made in April to change the name of our party. Perhaps I would propose a compromise to my comrades, namely to call ourselves the Communist Party, but to retain the word Bolshevik in brackets. But the question of the name of the party is incomparably less important than the question of the attitude of the revolutionary proletariat to the state. In the usual argument about the state, the mistake is constantly made against which Engels warned, and which we have in passing indicated above. Namely, it is constantly forgotten that the abolition of the state means also the abolition of democracy, that the withering away of the state means the withering away of democracy. At first sight, this assertion seems exceedingly strange and incomprehensible. Indeed, someone may even suspect us of expecting the advent of a system of society in which the principle of subordination of the minority to the majority will not be observed, for democracy means the recognition of this very principle. No, democracy is not identical with the subordination of the minority to the majority. Democracy is a state which recognizes the subordination of the minority to the majority, i.e., an organization for the systematic use of force by one class against another, by one section of the population against another. We set ourselves the ultimate aim of abolishing the state, i.e., all organized and systematic violence, all use of violence against people in general. We do not expect the advent of a system of society in which the principle of subordination of the minority to the majority will not be observed. In striving for socialism, however, we are convinced that it will develop into communism, and therefore that the need for violence against people in general for the subordination of one man to another and of one section of the population to another, will vanish altogether, since people will become accustomed to observing the elementary conditions of social life without violence and without subordination. In order to emphasize this element of habit, Engels speaks of a new generation, quote, reared in new, free social conditions, which will, quote, be able to discard the entire lumber of the state, of any state, including the democratic republican state. In order to explain this, it is necessary to analyze the economic basis of the withering away of the state. And that's the end of chapter 4. Now beginning chapter 5, the economic basis of the withering away of the state. Marx explains this question most thoroughly in his Critique of the Gotha program, letter to Braque, May 5th, 1878, which was not published until 1891, when it was printed in Neue Zeit, volume 9, and which has appeared in Russian in a special edition. The polemical part of this remarkable work, which contains a criticism of Lassalleanism, has, so to speak, overshadowed its positive part, namely the analysis of the connection between the development of communism and the withering away of the state. Section 1. Presentation of the question by Marx. From a superficial comparison of Marx's letter to Braque of May 5th, 1878, with Engels' letter to Bebel of March 28, 1875, which we examined above, it might appear that Marx was much more of a, quote, champion of the state than Engels, and that the difference of opinion between the two writers on the question of the state was very considerable. Engels suggested to Bebel that all chatter about the state be dropped altogether, that the word state be eliminated from the program altogether, and the word community substituted for it. Engels even declared that the commune was long a state in the proper sense of the word. Yet Marx even spoke of the, quote, future state in communist society, i.e. he would seem to recognize the need for the state even under communism. But such a view would be fundamentally wrong. A closer examination shows that Marx's and Engels' views on the state and its withering away were completely identical, and that Marx's expression, quoted above, refers to the state in the process of withering away. Clearly, there can be no question of specifying the moment of the future withering away, the more so since it will obviously be a lengthy process. The apparent difference between Marx and Engels is due to the fact that they dealt with different subjects and pursued different aims. Marx set out to show Bebel graphically, sharply, and in broad outline the utter absurdity of the current prejudices concerning the state, shared to no small degree by Lassalle. Marx only touched upon this question in passing, being interested in another subject, namely the development of communist society. The whole theory of Marx is the application of the theory of development, in its most consistent, complete, considered, and pithy form, to modern capitalism. Naturally, Marx was faced with the problem of applying this theory both to the forthcoming collapse of capitalism and to the future development of future communism. On the basis of what facts, then, can the question of the future development of future communism be dealt with? On the basis of the fact that it has its origin in capitalism, that it develops historically from capitalism, that it is the result of the action of a social force to which capitalism gave birth. There is no trace of an attempt on Marx's part to make up a utopia, to indulge in idle guesswork about what cannot be known. Marx treated the question of communism in the same way as a naturalist would treat the question of the development of, say, a new biological variety, once he knew that it had originated in such and such a way and was changing in such and such a definite direction. To begin with, Marx brushed aside the confusion the Gotha program brought into the question of the relationship between state and society. He wrote, quote, "Present-day society is capitalist society, which exists in all civilized countries, being more or less free from medieval admixture, more or less modified by the particular historical development of each country, more or less developed. On the other hand, the present-day state changes with a country's frontier. It is different in the Prusso-German Empire from what it is in Switzerland, and different in England from what it is in the United States. The present-day state is therefore a fiction. Quote, nevertheless, the different states of the different civilized countries in spite of their motley diversity of form, all have this in common, that they are based on modern bourgeois society, only one more or less capitalistically developed. They have, therefore, also certain essential characteristics in common. In this sense, it is possible to speak of the present-day state in contrast with the future, in which its present root, bourgeois society, will have died off. Quoting again, the question then arises, what transformation will the state undergo in communist society? In other words, what social functions will remain in existence there that are analogous to present state functions? This question can only be answered scientifically, and one does not get a flea hop nearer to the problem by a thousandfold combination of the word people with the word state, unquote. Comment, that was a little funny. I almost laughed. After thus ridiculing all talk about a people's state, Marx formulated the question and gave warning, as it were, that those seeking a scientific answer to it should use only firmly established scientific data. The first fact that has been established most accurately by the whole theory of development, by science as a whole, a fact that was ignored by the utopians and is ignored by the present-day opportunists, who are afraid of the socialist revolution, is that, historically, there must undoubtedly be a special stage, or a special phase, of transition from capitalism to communism. End of section 1, beginning section 2, the transition from capitalism to communism. Marx continued, quote, between capitalist and communist society lies the period of the revolutionary transformation of the one into the other. Corresponding to this is also a political transition period, in which the state can be nothing but the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat, unquote. Marx bases this conclusion on an analysis of the role played by the proletariat in modern capitalist society, on the data concerning the development of this society, and on the irreconcilability of the antagonistic interests of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Previously, the question was put as follows. To achieve its emancipation, the proletariat must overthrow the bourgeoisie, win political power, and advance its revolutionary dictatorship. Now the question is put somewhat differently. The transition from capitalist society, which is developing towards communism, to communist society, is impossible without a, quote, political transition period, and the state in this period can only be the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. What, then, is the relation of this dictatorship to democracy? We have seen that the Communist Manifesto simply places side by side the two concepts, quote, to raise the proletariat to the position of the ruling class, and, quote, to win the battle of democracy. On the basis of all that has been said above, it is possible to determine more precisely how democracy changes in the transition from capitalism to communism. In capitalist society, providing it develops under the most favorable conditions, we have a more or less complete democracy in the democratic republic. But this democracy is always hemmed in by the narrow limits set by capitalist exploitation, and consequently always remains, in effect, a democracy for the minority, only for the propertied classes, only for the rich. Freedom in capitalist society always remains about the same as it was in the ancient Greek republics, freedom for the slave owners. Owing to the conditions of capitalist exploitation, the modern wage slaves are so crushed by want and poverty that they, quote, cannot be bothered with democracy, cannot be bothered with politics. In the ordinary peaceful course of events, the majority of the population is debarred from participation in public and political life. Quick comment, we see that half of the people in the United States who could vote don't vote. That, I think, is very much a case of being so crushed by want and poverty that they cannot be bothered with democracy or politics. Some of it, of course, as you know, we talk about politics a lot on this channel. Some of it, of course, is, you know, having evaluated the Democrats and the Republicans and the Libertarians, they see that they're all crap who will sell them out. I think definitely part of it's that. When it comes to the question of why don't more people vote PSL or Green or something like that, I think it's definitely a case of the latter, is people are too run down with their day-to-day lives and the horrible poverty that we face to, just stay current at all. Of course, we try to help with people staying informed here, as do other similar channels, but there are limits and material conditions. When you're working 50, 60 hours a week, it's hard to crack open the news, when you finally get some free time. All right, continuing. The correctness of this statement is perhaps most clearly confirmed by Germany, because constitutional legality steadily endured there for a remarkably long time, nearly half a century, 1871 to 1914. And during this period, the Social Democrats were able to achieve far more than in other countries in the way of, quote, utilizing legality, and organized a larger proportion of the workers into a political party than anywhere else in the world. What is this largest proportion of politically conscious and active wage slaves that has so far been recorded in capitalist society? 1 million members of the Social Democratic Party out of 15 million wage workers, 3 million organized in trade unions out of 15 million. Democracy for an insignificant minority, democracy for the rich. That is the democracy of capitalist society. If we look more closely into the machinery of capitalist democracy, we see everywhere, in the, quote, petty, supposedly petty, details of the suffrage, residential qualifications, exclusion of women, etc., in the technique of the representative institutions, in the actual obstacles to the right of assembly, public buildings are not for paupers, etc., in the purely capitalist organization of the daily press, etc., etc., we see restriction after restriction upon democracy. These restrictions, exceptions, exclusions, obstacles for the poor seem slight, especially in the eyes of one who has never known want himself and has never been in close contact with the oppressed classes in their mass life. And 9 out of 10, if not 99 out of 100, bourgeois publicists and politicians come under this category. But in their sum total, these restrictions exclude and squeeze out the poor from politics, from active participation in democracy. Comment, well said. That's a very good passage. Marx grasped the essence of capitalist democracy splendidly when, in analyzing the experience of the commune, he said that the oppressed are allowed once every few years to decide which particular representatives of the oppressing class shall represent and repress them in Parliament. But from this capitalist democracy that is inevitably narrow and stealthily pushes aside the poor and is therefore hypocritical and false through and through, forward development does not proceed simply, directly, and smoothly towards greater and greater democracy, as the liberal professors and petty bourgeois opportunists would have us believe. Democratic Party. No, forward development, i.e. development towards communism, proceeds through the dictatorship of the proletariat and cannot do otherwise, for the resistance of the capitalist exploiters cannot be broken by anyone else or in any other way. And the dictatorship of the proletariat, i.e. the organization of the vanguard of the oppressed as the ruling class for the purpose of suppressing the oppressors, cannot result merely in an expansion of democracy. Simultaneously with an immense expansion of democracy, which for the first time becomes democracy for the poor, democracy for the people, and not democracy for the money bags, the dictatorship of the proletariat imposes a series of restrictions on the freedom of the oppressors, the exploiters, the capitalists. We must suppress them in order to free humanity from wage slavery. Their resistance must be crushed by force. It is clear that there is no freedom and no democracy where there is suppression and where there is violence. Engels expressed this splendidly in his letter to Bebel when he said, as the reader will remember, that, quote, the proletariat needs the state, not in the interests of freedom, but in order to hold down its adversaries, and as soon as it becomes possible to speak of freedom, the state as such ceases to exist, unquote. Democracy for the vast majority of the people, and suppression by force, i.e. exclusion from democracy, of the exploiters and oppressors of the people. This is the change democracy undergoes during the transition from capitalism to communism. Only in communist society, when the resistance of the capitalists have disappeared, when there are no classes, i.e., when there is no distinction between the members of society as regards their relation to the social means of production, only then, quote, the state ceases to exist, and, quote, it becomes possible to speak of freedom. Only then will a truly complete democracy become possible and be realized, a democracy without any exceptions whatever. And only then will democracy begin to wither away, owing to the simple fact that, freed from capitalist slavery, from the untold horrors, savagery, absurdities, and infamies of capitalist exploitation, people will gradually become accustomed to observing the elementary rules of social intercourse that have been known for centuries and repeated for thousands of years in all copybook maxims. They will become accustomed to observing them without force, without coercion, without subordination, without the special apparatus for coercion called the state. The expression, the state withers away, is very well known, for it indicates both the gradual and the spontaneous nature of this process. Only habit can, and undoubtedly will, have such an effect, for we see around us on millions of occasions how readily people become accustomed to observing the necessary rules of social intercourse when there is no exploitation, when there is nothing that arouses indignation, evokes protest and revolt, and creates the need for suppression. And so in capitalist society, we have a democracy that is curtailed, wretched, false, a democracy only for the rich, for the minority. The dictatorship of the proletariat, the period of transition to communism, will for the first time create democracy for the people, for the majority, along with the necessary suppression of the exploiters of the minority. Communism alone is capable of providing really complete democracy, and the more complete it is, the sooner it will become unnecessary and wither away of its own accord. In other words, under capitalism we have the state in another sense of the word. That is, a special machine for the suppression of one class by another, and what is more, of the majority by the minority. Naturally, to be successful, such an undertaking as the systematic suppression of the exploited majority by the exploiting minority calls for the utmost ferocity and savagery in the matter of suppressing. It calls for seas of blood, through which mankind is actually wading its way in slavery, serfdom, and wage labor. Furthermore, during the transition from capitalism to communism, suppression is still necessary, but it is now the suppression of the exploiting minority by the exploited majority. A special apparatus, a special machine for suppression, the state, is still necessary, but this is now a transitional state. It is no longer a state in the proper sense of the word, for the suppression of the minority of exploiters by the majority of the wage slaves of yesterday is comparatively so easy, simple, and natural a task that it will entail far less bloodshed than the suppression of the risings of slaves, serfs, or wage laborers, and it will cost mankind far less. And it is compatible with the extension of democracy to such an overwhelming majority of the population that the need for a special machine of suppression will begin to disappear. Naturally, the exploiters are unable to suppress the people without a highly complex machine for performing this task, but the people can suppress the exploiters even with a very simple machine, almost without a machine, without a special apparatus, by the simple organization of the armed people, such as the Soviets of the Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies, we would remark, running ahead. So a quick comment, speaking of running ahead, I'll run ahead a little bit. So, of course, this discussion is mainly, at least implicitly, describing actions within a particular society. But if we pull back a little bit and think about international relations, it could be argued that one of the major problems contributing to the Soviet Union's eventual ripeness for defeat was the huge military buildup that the United States in particular was able to bait them into undertaking. In a way, this is the exact opposite of the withering away of the state, because perhaps within the society, where the workers' state has power to suppress the bourgeoisie, they're unable to do so outside of that government's jurisdiction. So you still have bourgeoisie running around and trying to oppress the whole of the country from the outside. So this opens up entirely new questions, which beginning socialists often struggle with. Is, does socialism have to happen everywhere in the world at once, or like how does this happen? And in fact, there are very famous disputes within socialism. For example, the dispute between Trotsky and Stalin not long after the founding of the Soviet Union on the question of permanent revolution, or in other words, immediately trying to take on capitalist Europe again and turn it socialist, or do you focus just on building a better socialism and stabilizing the country that your government actually has control of? And what do you do then? It's the question of how does, once you have secured socialism in one location, what is the role of the state in addressing the rest of capitalist exploitation in the rest of the world? So, huge questions, interesting questions, and let's continue on with the text, and we'll see what is left to discuss at the end in the comments. Without building utopias, Marx defined more fully what can be defined now regarding this future, namely, the differences between the lower and higher phases, or levels, stages, of communist society. That's the end of section 2, beginning section 3, the first phase of communist society. In the Critique of the Gotha program, Marx goes into detail to disprove Lassalle's idea that under socialism, the worker will receive the, quote, undiminished, or, quote, full product of his labor. Marx shows that from the whole of the social labor of society, there must be deducted a reserve fund, a fund for the expansion of production, a fund for the replacement of the, quote, wear and tear of machinery, and so on. Then, from the means of consumption must be deducted a fund for administrative expenses, for schools, hospitals, old people's homes, and so on. Instead of Lassalle's hazy, obscure, general phrase, the full product of his labor to the worker, Marx makes a sober estimate of exactly how socialist society will have to manage its affairs. Marx proceeds to make a concrete analysis of the conditions of a life of a society in which there will be no capitalism, and says, quote, "What we have to deal with here in analyzing the program of the Workers' Party is a communist society, not as it has developed on its own foundations, but on the contrary, just as it emerges from capitalist society, which is thus in every respect, economically, morally, and intellectually, still stamped with the birthmarks of the old society from whose womb it comes," unquote. It is this communist society which has just emerged into the light of day out of the womb of capitalism, and which is in every respect stamped with the birthmarks of the old society, that Marx terms the, quote, first or lower phase of communist society. The means of production are no longer the private property of individuals. The means of production belong to the whole of society. Every member of society, performing a certain part of the socially necessary work, receives a certificate from society to the effect that he has done a certain amount of work. And with this certificate, he receives from the public store of consumer goods a corresponding quantity of products. After a deduction is made of the amount of labor which goes to the public fund, every worker therefore receives from society as much as he has given to it. Equality apparently reigns supreme. But when Lassalle, having in view such a social order, usually called socialism but termed by Marx the first phase of communism, says that this is, quote, equitable distribution, that this is, quote, the equal right of all to an equal product of labor, Lassalle is mistaken, and Marx exposes the mistake. Quote, "Hence the equal right," says Marx, "in this case still certainly conforms to bourgeois law, which, like all law, implies inequality. All law is an application of an equal measure to different people, who are in fact not alike, are not equal to one another. That is why the, quote, equal right is a violation of equality and an injustice. In fact, everyone, having performed as much social labor as another, receives an equal share of the social product after the above-mentioned deductions. But people are not alike. One is strong, another is weak. One is married, another is not. One has more children, another has less, and so on. And the conclusion Marx draws is, quote, with an equal performance of labor, and hence an equal share in the social consumption fund, one will in fact receive more than another, one will be richer than another, and so on. To avoid all these defects, the right instead of being equal would have to be unequal, unquote. The first phase of communism, therefore, cannot yet provide justice and equality. Differences, and unjust differences, in wealth will still persist, but the exploitation of man by man will have become impossible because it will be impossible to seize the means of production, the factories, machines, land, etc., and make them private property. In smashing Lassalle's petty bourgeois vague phrases about equality and justice in general, Marx shows the course of development of communist society, which is compelled to abolish at first only the injustice of the means of production seized by individuals, and which is unable at once to eliminate the other injustice, which consists in the distribution of consumer goods, quote, according to the amount of labor performed and not according to needs. The vulgar economists, including the bourgeois professors and, quote, our Tugend, constantly reproached the socialists with forgetting the inequality of people and with, quote, dreaming of eliminating this inequality. Such a reproach, as we see, only proves the extreme ignorance of the bourgeois ideologists. Quick comment, I remember in high school being given the science fiction story Harrison Bergeron by Kurt Vonnegut and being told that it was a refutation of exactly what Lenin is talking about here. I thought at the time, even then, this was before I encountered any Marx, that it was kind of like a heavy-handed and absurd criticism of socialist efforts to like make people perfectly biologically equal, which, I mean, even at that time, I was like, I don't think they really do that, do they? Anyway, let's continue. Marx not only most scrupulously takes account of the inevitable inequality of men, but he also takes into account the fact that the mere conversion of the means of production into the common property of the whole society, commonly called socialism, does not remove the defects of distribution and the inequality of, quote, bourgeois laws, which continues to prevail so long as products are divided, quote, according to the amount of labor performed. Continuing, Marx says, quote, but these defects are inevitable in the first phase of communist society, as it is when it has just emerged, after prolonged birth pangs from capitalist society. Law can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development conditioned thereby, unquote. And so, in the first phase of communist society, usually called socialism, bourgeois law is not abolished in its entirety, but only in part, only in proportion to the economic revolution so far attained, i.e., only in respect of the means of production. Bourgeois law recognizes them as the private property of individuals. Socialism converts them into common property. To that extent, and to that extent alone, bourgeois law disappears. However, it persists as far as its other part is concerned. It persists in the capacity of regulator, determining factor, in the distribution of products, and the allotment of labor among the members of society. The socialist principle, he who does not work shall not eat, is already realized. The other socialist principle, an equal amount of products for an equal amount of labor, is also already realized. But this is not yet communism, and it does not yet abolish bourgeois law, which gives unequal individuals, in return for unequal, really unequal, amounts of labor, equal amounts of products. This is a defect, says Marx, but it is unavoidable in the first phase of communism. For if we are not to indulge in utopianism, we must not think that having overthrown capitalism, people will at once learn to work for society without any rules of law. Besides, the abolition of capitalism does not immediately create the economic prerequisites for such a change. Now, there are no other rules than those of bourgeois law. To this extent, therefore, there still remains the need for a state which, while safeguarding the common ownership of the means of production, would safeguard equality in labor and in the distribution of products. The state withers away insofar as there are no longer any capitalists, any classes, and consequently no class can be suppressed. But the state has not yet completely withered away, since there still remains the safeguarding of bourgeois law, which sanctifies actual inequality. For the state to wither away completely, complete communism is necessary. End of section 3. Section 4, the higher phase of communist society. Marx continues, quote, "In a higher phase of communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and with it also the antithesis between mental and physical labor, has vanished, after labor has become not only a livelihood, but life's prime want, after the productive forces have increased with the all-around development of the individual, and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois law be left behind in its entirety, and society inscribe on its banners, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs." Unquote. Only now can we fully appreciate the correctness of Engels' remarks, mercilessly ridiculing the absurdity of combining the words freedom and state. So long as the state exists, there is no freedom. When there is freedom, there will be no state. The economic basis for the complete withering away of the state is such a high state of development of communism, at which the antithesis between mental and physical labor disappears, at which there consequently disappears one of the principal sources of modern social inequality, a source, moreover, which cannot, on any account, be removed immediately by the mere conversion of the means of production into public property, by the mere expropriation of the capitalists. This expropriation will make it possible for the productive forces to develop to a tremendous extent. And when we see how incredibly capitalism is already retarding this development, when we see how much progress could be achieved on the basis of the level of technique already attained, we are entitled to say with the fullest confidence that the expropriation of the capitalists will inevitably result in an enormous development of the productive forces of human society. But how rapidly this development will proceed, how soon it will reach the point of breaking away from the division of labor, of doing away with the antithesis between mental and physical labor, of transforming labor into life's prime want, we do not and cannot know. That is why we are entitled to speak only of the inevitable withering away of the state, emphasizing the protracted nature of this process and its dependence upon the rapidity of development of the higher phase of communism, and leaving the question of the time required for, or the concrete forms of, the withering away quite open, because there is no material for answering these questions. The state will be able to wither away completely when society adopts the rule, quote, "from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs," i.e., when people have become so accustomed to observing the fundamental rules of social intercourse, and when their labor has become so productive that they will voluntarily work according to their ability. The narrow horizon of bourgeois law, which compels one to calculate with the heartlessness of a Shylock whether one has not worked half an hour more than everybody else, this narrow horizon will then be left behind. There will then be no need for society, in distributing the products, to regulate the quantity to be received by each. Each will take freely according to his needs. From the bourgeois point of view, it is easy to declare that such a social order is, quote, "sheer utopia," and to sneer at the socialists for promising everyone the right to receive from society, without any control over the labor of the individual citizen, any quantity of truffles, cars, pianos, etc. Even to this day, most bourgeois savants confine themselves to sneering in this way, comment, "nothing has changed," thereby betraying both their ignorance and their selfish defense of capitalism. Ignorance, for it has never entered the head of any socialist to promise that the higher phase of the development of communism will arrive. As for the greatest socialists' forecasts that it will arrive, it presupposes not the present ordinary run of people who, like the seminary students in Polyamovsky's stories, are capable of damaging the stocks of public wealth just for fun and of demanding the impossible. Commenting, I'm so glad Lenin put in that section because you see among anti-communist trolls very often, particularly like, Pepe Kek flag kind of people, making like, well, what if I wanted to do this? And it's like, well, it's because you're a fucking moron raised in bourgeois society who is afraid of communism, and that's the only reason you're like saying that in the first place. In an actual society where people were just sort of going about their life, immediately, if you tried to do that, somebody would just like shout you down for being a moron, and like you wouldn't dare do it because all of society would immediately be like scowling at you, or worse. And already, many people already disapprove of these people, but under a communist society that would be providing very well for people, that people would be happy with, no one would tolerate these people for even an instant. Okay, back to the text. Until the higher phase of communism arrives, the socialists demand the strictest control by society and by the state over the measure of labor and the measure of consumption. But this control must start with the expropriation of the capitalists, with the establishment of workers' control over the capitalists, and must be exercised not by a state of bureaucrats, but by a state of armed workers. The selfish defense of capitalism by the bourgeois ideologists and their hangers-on, like the Tseretellis, Chernovs, and company, consists in that they substitute arguing and talk about the distant future for the vital and burning question of present-day politics, namely the expropriation of the capitalists, the conversion of all citizens into workers, and other employees of one huge syndicate, the whole state, and the complete subordination of the entire work of this syndicate to a genuinely democratic state, the state of the Soviets of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies. In fact, when a learned professor, followed by the Philistine, followed in turn by the Tseretellis and Chernovs, talks of wild utopias, of the demagogic promises of the Bolsheviks, of the impossibility of introducing socialism, it is the higher stage or phase of communism that they have in mind, which no one has ever promised or even thought to introduce because, generally speaking, it cannot be introduced. Comment meaning you cannot start with that. You cannot go from capitalism right to that. One other quick comment also. This is the second place where a phrase like "he who does not work cannot eat" or "conversion of all citizens into workers," etc. I have seen misunderstanding of this applied to people who currently are unemployed, etc. I just want to make clear, people who are unemployed are considered workers. They are workers who are put out of work by capital, not by their own, parasitic class interests. When Marx talks about people who don't work not eating, he means capitalists don't work. They live off of other people's work like parasites. This is not, and I want to be very clear about this, an attack on people who receive welfare benefits, etc., under capitalism. Those are, as socialists would consider, working people who got fucked over by capitalists. Want to be real clear about that. Right-wingers often pervert these things, as they pervert a lot in socialism, to try to deprive us of our phrases and their meaning. Like they took right to work, which originally meant the right to meaningful, dignified work that you can actually, have a good standard of living doing. And they turned it into an anti-labor union slogan. It's the same here, where they use slogans like, those who don't work can't eat, and they turn it into an attack on working people who are receiving assistance because capitalism isn't paying them enough to live or something like that. Right-wingers often, this is standard practice, take radical rhetoric pervert it, and then use it to punch down, but only by twisting its meaning. Don't be fooled. Okay, continuing. And this brings us to the question of the scientific distinction between socialism and communism, which Engels touched on in his above-quoted argument about the incorrectness of the name Social Democrat. Politically, the distinction between the first, or lower, and the higher phase of communism will in time probably be tremendous. But it would be ridiculous to recognize this distinction now under capitalism, and only individual anarchists, perhaps, could invest it with primary importance, if there still are people among the anarchists who have learned nothing from the Plekhanov conversion of the Kropotkins, of Grave, of Cornelisine, and other stars of anarchism into social chauvinists or anarcho-trenchists, as Gué, one of the few anarchists who have still preserved a sense of humor and a conscience, has put it. But the scientific distinction between socialism and communism is clear. What is usually called socialism was termed by Marx the first, or lower phase of communist society. Insofar as the means of production becomes common property, the word communism is also applicable here, providing we do not forget that this is not complete communism. The great significance of Marx's explanations is that here too he consistently applies materialist dialectics, the theory of development, and regards communism as something which develops out of capitalism. Instead of scholastically invented, concocted definitions and fruitless disputes over words, what is socialism? What is communism? Marx gives an analysis of what might be called the stages of the economic maturity of communism. In its first phase or first stage, communism cannot as yet be fully mature economically and entirely free from traditions or vestiges of capitalism. Hence the interesting phenomenon that communism in its first phase retains, quote, the narrow horizon of bourgeois law. Of course, bourgeois law in regard to the distribution of consumer goods inevitably presupposes the existence of the bourgeois state, for law is nothing without an apparatus capable of enforcing the observance of the rules of law. It follows that under communism there remains for a time not only bourgeois law, but even the bourgeois state without the bourgeoisie. This may sound like a paradox, or simply a dialectical conundrum, of which Marxism is often accused by people who have not taken the slightest trouble to study its extraordinarily profound content. But in fact, remnants of the old, surviving in the new, confront us in life at every step, both in nature and in society. And Marx did not arbitrarily insert a scrap of bourgeois law into communism, but indicated what is economically and politically inevitable in a society emerging out of the womb of capitalism. Democracy means equality. The great significance of the proletariat's struggle for equality and of equality as a slogan will be clear if we correctly interpret it as meaning the abolition of classes. But democracy means only formal equality, and as soon as equality is achieved for all members of society in relation to ownership of the means of production, that is, equality of labor and wages, humanity will inevitably be confronted with the question of advancing further from formal equality to actual equality, i.e., to the operation of the rule, from each according to their ability to each according to their needs. By what stages, by means of what practical measures humanity will proceed to this supreme aim we do not and cannot know. But it is important to realize how infinitely mendacious is the ordinary bourgeois conception of socialism as something lifeless, rigid, fixed once and for all, whereas in reality, only socialism will be the beginning of a rapid, genuine, truly mass-forward movement, embracing first the majority and then the whole of the population in all spheres of public and private life. Comment: I really like that passage. I think that it really captures the potential of moving beyond capitalism to really explode into an age of technology and sociological rearrangement that we just can barely begin to fathom right now. Continuing. Democracy is of enormous importance to the working class in its struggle against the capitalists for its emancipation. But democracy is by no means a boundary not to be overstepped. It is only one of the stages on the road from feudalism to capitalism, and from capitalism to communism. Democracy is a form of the state. It represents, on the one hand, the organized, systematic use of force against persons, but on the other hand, it signifies the formal recognition of equality of citizens, the equal right of all to determine the structure of and to administer the state. This in turn results in the fact that at a certain stage in the development of democracy, it first welds together the class that wages a revolutionary struggle against capitalism, the proletariat, and enables it to crush, smash to atoms, wipe off the face of the earth, the bourgeois, even the Republican bourgeois state machine, the standing army, the police, and the bureaucracy, and to substitute for them a more democratic state machine, but a state machine nevertheless, in the shape of armed workers who proceed to form a militia involving the entire population. Here, quantity turns into quality. Such a degree of democracy implies overstepping the boundaries of bourgeois society and beginning its socialist reorganization. If really all take part in the administration of the state, capitalism cannot retain its hold. The development of capitalism, in turn, creates the preconditions that enable really all to take part in the administration of the state. Some of these preconditions are universal literacy, which has already been achieved in a number of the most advanced capitalist countries, then the training and disciplining of millions of workers by the huge, complex, socialized apparatus of the postal service, railways, big factories, large-scale commerce, banking, etc., etc. Quick comment. My strong suspicion is that a lot of the more reactionary elements in the United States know this, have studied this, and are deliberately just trying to keep people from reaching that stage of development by any means necessary, even if it means retarding their own system. Continuing. Given these economic preconditions, it is quite possible, after the overthrow of the capitalists and the bureaucrats, to proceed immediately, overnight, to replace them in the control over production and distribution, in the work of keeping account of labor and products, by the armed workers, by the whole of the armed population. The question of control and accounting should not be confused with the question of the scientifically trained staff of engineers, agronomists, and so on. These gentlemen are working today in obedience to the wishes of the capitalists, and will work even better tomorrow in obedience to the wishes of the armed workers. Accounting and control, that is mainly what is needed for the smooth working, for the proper functioning of the first phase of communist society. All citizens are transformed into hired employees of the state, which consists of the armed workers. All citizens become employees and workers of a single countrywide state syndicate. All that is required is that they should work equally, do their proper share of work, and get equal pay. The accounting and control necessary for this have been simplified by capitalism to the utmost and reduced to the extraordinarily simple operations which any literate person can perform of supervising and recording, knowledge of the 4 rules of arithmetic, and issuing appropriate receipts. When the majority of the people begin independently and everywhere to keep such accounts and exercise such control over the capitalists, now converted into employees, and over the intellectual gentry who preserve their capitalist habits, this control will really become universal, general, and popular, and there will be no getting away from it. There will be nowhere to go. The whole of society will have become a single office and a single factory with equality of labor and pay. But this factory discipline, which the proletariat, after defeating the capitalists, after overthrowing the exploiters, will extend to the whole of society, is by no means our ideal or our ultimate goal. It is only a necessary step for thoroughly cleansing society of all the infamies and abominations of capitalist exploitation and for further progress. From the moment all members of society, or at least the vast majority, have learned to administer the state themselves, have taken this work into their own hands, have organized control over the insignificant capitalist minority, over the gentry who wish to preserve their capitalist habits, and over the workers who have been thoroughly corrupted by capitalism. From this moment, the need for government of any kind begins to disappear altogether. The more complete the democracy, the nearer the moment when it becomes unnecessary. The more democratic the state, which consists of the armed workers, and which is, quote, no longer a state in the proper sense of the word, the more rapidly every form of state begins to wither away. For when all have learned to administer and actually to independently administer social production, independently keep accounts and exercise control over the parasites, the sons of the wealthy, the swindlers, and other guardians of capitalist traditions, the escape from this popular accounting and control will inevitably become so incredibly difficult, such a rare exception, and will probably be accompanied by such swift and severe punishment, for the armed workers are practical men and not sentimental intellectuals, and they scarcely allow anyone to trifle with them, that the necessity of observing the simple fundamental rules of the community will very soon become a habit. Then the door will be thrown wide open for the transition from the first phase of communist society to its higher phase, and with it to the complete withering away of the state. And that's the end of chapter 5, now beginning chapter 6, the vulgarization of Marxism by opportunists. The question of the relation of the state to the social revolution and of the social revolution to the state, like the question of revolution generally, was given very little attention by the leading theoreticians and publicists of the Second International, 1889 to 1914. But the most characteristic thing about the process of the gradual growth of opportunism that led to the collapse of the Second International in 1914 is the fact that even when these people were squarely faced with this question, they tried to evade it or ignored it. In general, it may be said that evasiveness over the question of the relation of the proletarian revolution to the state, an evasiveness which benefited and fostered opportunism, resulted in the distortion of Marxism and in its complete vulgarization. To characterize this lamentable process, if only briefly, we shall take the most prominent theoreticians of Marxism, Plekhanov and Kautsky. Section 1. Plekhanov's controversy with the anarchists. Plekhanov wrote a special pamphlet on the relation of anarchism to socialism, entitled Anarchism and Socialism, which was published in German in 1894. In treating this subject, Plekhanov contrived completely to evade the most urgent, burning, and most politically essential issue in the struggle against anarchism, namely, the relation of the revolution to the state and the question of the state in general. His pamphlet falls into two distinct parts. One of them is historical and literary, and contains valuable material on the ideas of Stirner, Proudhon, and others. The other is Philistine, and contains a clumsy dissertation on the theme that an anarchist cannot be distinguished from a bandit. It is a most amusing combination of subjects, and most characteristic of Plekhanov's whole activity on the eve of the revolution, and during the revolutionary period in Russia. In fact, in the years 1905 to 1917, Plekhanov revealed himself as a semi-doctrinaire and semi-Philistine, who in politics trailed in the wake of the bourgeoisie. We have now seen how, in their controversy with the anarchists, Marx and Engels, with the utmost thoroughness, explained their views on the relation of revolution to the state. In 1891, in his foreword to Marx's Critique of the Gotha Program, Engels wrote that we, that is, Engels and Marx, quote, were at that time, hardly 2 years after the Hague Conference of the First International, engaged in the most violent struggle against Bakunin and his anarchists, unquote. The anarchists had tried to claim the Paris Commune as their own, so to say, as a collaboration of their doctrine, and they completely misunderstood its lessons and Marx's analysis of these lessons. Anarchism has given nothing even approximating true answers to the concrete political questions. Must the old state machine be smashed, and what should be put in its place? But to speak of anarchism and socialism, while completely evading the question of the state and disregarding the whole development of Marxism before and after the Commune, meant inevitably slipping into opportunism. For what opportunism needs, most of all, is that the two questions just mentioned should not be raised at all. That in itself is a victory for opportunism. Section 2. Kautsky's controversy with the opportunists. Undoubtedly, an immeasurably larger number of Kautsky's works have been translated into Russian than into any other language. It is not without reason that some German Social Democrats say in jest that Kautsky is read more in Russia than in Germany. Let us say, in parenthesis, that this jest has a far deeper historical meaning than those who first made it suspect. The Russian workers, by making in 1905 an unusually great and unprecedented demand for the best works of the best social democratic literature, and editions of these works in quantities unheard of in other countries, rapidly transplanted, so to speak, the enormous experience of a neighboring, more advanced country to the young soil of our proletarian movement. Besides his popularization of Marxism, Kautsky is particularly known in our country for his controversy with the opportunists, with Bernstein at their head. One fact, however, is almost unknown, one which cannot be ignored if we set out to investigate how Kautsky drifted into the morass of unbelievably disgraceful confusion and defense of social chauvinism during the supreme crisis of 1914 to 1915. This fact is as follows. Shortly before he came out against the most prominent representatives of opportunism in France, Millerand and Jaure, and in Germany, Bernstein, Kautsky betrayed very considerable vacillation. The Marxist Zarya, which was published in Stuttgart in 1901 to 1902 and advocated revolutionary proletarian views, was forced to enter into controversy with Kautsky and describe as elastic the half-hearted, evasive resolution, conciliatory towards the opportunists, that he proposed at the International Socialist Congress in Paris in 1900. Kautsky's letters published in Germany reveal no less hesitancy on his part before he took the field against Bernstein. Of immeasurably greater significance, however, is the fact that in his very controversy with the opportunists, in his formulation of the question and his manner of treating it, we can now see, as we study the history of Kautsky's latest betrayal of Marxism, his systematic deviation towards opportunism precisely on the question of the state. Let us take Kautsky's first important work against opportunism, Bernstein and the Social Democratic Program. Kautsky refutes Bernstein in detail, but here's a characteristic thing. Bernstein, in his Premises of Socialism, of Herostratian fame, accuses Marxism of Blanchism, an accusation since repeated thousands of times by the opportunists and liberal bourgeoisie in Russia against the revolutionary Marxists, the Bolsheviks. Quick comment, I recently was asked by a viewer to comment on a 4-part anarchist series by a YouTuber named Anarch called The State is Counter-Revolutionary, and that claim of Blanchism is made numerous times. So that is something that still goes on today in the 2020s. Continuing. In this connection, Bernstein dwells particularly on Marx's The Civil War in France, and tries, quite unsuccessfully as we have seen, to identify Marx's views on the lessons of the Commune with those of Proudhon. Bernstein pays particular attention to the conclusion which Marx emphasized in his 1872 preface to the Communist Manifesto, namely that, quote, the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes, unquote. This statement pleased Bernstein so much that he used it no less than 3 times in his book, interpreting it in the most distorted, opportunist way. As we have seen, Marx meant that the working class must smash, break, shatter the whole state machine. But according to Bernstein, it would appear as though Marx in these words warned the working class against excessive revolutionary zeal when seizing power. A cruder, more hideous distortion of Marx's idea cannot be imagined. How then did Kautsky proceed in his most detailed refutation of Bernsteinism? He refrained from analyzing the utter distortion of Marxism by opportunism on this point. He cited the above-quoted passage from Engels' preface to Marx's Civil War and said that, according to Marx, the working class cannot simply take over the ready-made state machinery, but that, generally speaking, it can take it over, and that was all. Kautsky did not say a word about the fact that Bernstein attributed to Marx the very opposite of Marx's real idea, that since 1852, Marx had formulated the task of the proletarian revolution as being to smash the state machine. The result was that the most essential distinction between Marxism and opportunism on the subject of the tasks of the proletarian revolution was slurred over by Kautsky. Quote, "We can quite safely leave the solution of the problems of the proletarian dictatorship of the future," said Kautsky, writing against Bernstein. This is not a polemic against Bernstein, but in essence a concession to him, a surrender to opportunism. For at present the opportunists ask nothing better than to, quote, "quite safely leave to the future" all fundamental questions of the tasks of the proletarian revolution. From 1852 to 1891, or for 40 years, Marx and Engels taught the proletariat that it must smash the state machine. Yet, in 1899, Kautsky, confronted with the complete betrayal of Marxism by the opportunists on this point, fraudulently substituted for the question whether it is necessary to smash this machine, the question for the concrete forms in which it is to be smashed, and then sought refuge behind the, quote, "indisputable and barren Philistine truth that concrete forms cannot be known in advance." A gulf separates Marx and Kautsky over their attitude towards the proletarian party's task of training the working class for revolution. Let us take the next, more mature, work by Kautsky, which was also largely devoted to a refutation of opportunist errors. It is his pamphlet, The Social Revolution. In this pamphlet, the author chose as his special theme the question of the proletarian revolution and the proletarian regime. He gave much that was exceedingly valuable, but he avoided the question of the state. Throughout the pamphlet, the author speaks of the winning of state power, and no more. That is, he has chosen a formula which makes a concession to the opportunists, inasmuch as it admits the possibility of seizing power without destroying the state machine. The very thing which Marx in 1872 declared to be obsolete in the program of the Communist Manifesto is revived by Kautsky in 1902. A special section in the pamphlet is devoted to the, quote, "forms and weapons of the social revolution." Here Kautsky speaks of the mass political strike, of civil war, and of the, quote, "instruments of the might of the modern large state, his bureaucracy and the army." But he does not say a word about what the Commune has already taught the workers. Evidently, it was not without reason that Engels issued a warning, particularly to the German socialists, against, quote, "superstitious reverence" for the state. Kautsky treats the matter as follows. The victorious proletariat, quote, "will carry out the democratic program," and he goes on to formulate its clauses. But he does not say a word about the new material provided in 1871 on the subject of the replacement of bourgeois democracy by proletarian democracy. Kautsky disposes of the question by using such, quote, "impressive-sounding banalities" as, quote, "still, it goes without saying that we shall not achieve supremacy under the present conditions. Revolution itself presupposes long and deep-going struggles, which, in themselves, will change our present political and social structure," unquote. Undoubtedly, this quote goes without saying, just as the fact that horses eat oats or the Volga flows into the Caspian. Only it is a pity that an empty and bombastic phrase about deep-going struggles is used to avoid a question of vital importance to the revolutionary proletariat, namely, what makes its revolution, quote, "deep-going," in relation to the state, to democracy, as distinct from previous, non-proletarian revolutions. By avoiding this question, Kautsky in practice makes a concession to opportunism on this most essential point, although in words he declares stern war against it and stresses the importance of the, quote, "idea of revolution." How much is this idea worth when one is afraid to teach the workers the concrete lessons of revolution, or says revolutionary idealism before everything else, or announces that the English workers are now, quote, "hardly more than petty bourgeois"? Quote, "The most varied form of enterprises, bureaucratic, trade unionist, cooperative, private, can exist side by side in socialist society," Kautsky writes. Quote, "There are, for example, enterprises which cannot do without a bureaucratic organization." Comment, Lenin has put 2 question marks in brackets after bureaucratic, apparently saying, what does this even mean? Such as the railways. Here the democratic organization may take the following shape. The workers elect delegates who form a sort of parliament, which establishes the working regulations and supervises the management of the bureaucratic apparatus. The management of other countries may be transferred to the trade unions, and still others may become cooperative enterprises, unquote. This argument is erroneous. It is a step backward compared with the explanations Marx and Engels gave in the 70s, using the lessons of the Commune as an example. As far as the supposedly necessary bureaucratic organization is concerned, there is no difference whatever between a railway and any other enterprise in large-scale machine industry, any factory, large shop, or large-scale capitalist agricultural enterprise. The technique of all these enterprises makes absolutely imperative the strictest discipline, the utmost precision on the part of everyone in carrying out his allotted task, for otherwise the whole enterprise may come to a stop, or machinery or the finished product may be damaged. In all these enterprises, the workers will, of course, quote, elect delegates who will form a sort of parliament. The whole point, however, is that this sort of parliament will not be a parliament in the sense of a bourgeois parliamentary institution. The whole point is that this sort of parliament will not merely, quote, establish the working regulations and supervise the management of the bureaucratic apparatus, as Kautsky, whose thinking does not go beyond the bounds of bourgeois parliamentarianism, imagines. In socialist society, the sort of parliament consisting of workers' deputies will, of course, quote, establish the working regulations and supervise the management of this apparatus, but this apparatus will not be bureaucratic. Kautsky has not reflected at all on Marx's words, quote, the Commune was a working, not parliamentary, body, executive, and legislative at the same time. Kautsky has not understood at all the difference between bourgeois parliamentarism, which combines democracy, not for the people, with the bureaucracy, against the people, and proletarian democracy, which will take immediate steps to cut bureaucracy down to the roots, and which will be able to carry these measures through to the end, to the complete abolition of bureaucracy, to the introduction of complete democracy for the people. Kautsky here displays the same old superstitious reverence for the state and superstitious belief in bureaucracy. Let us now pass to the last and best of Kautsky's works against the opportunists, his pamphlet, The Road to Power, which I believe has not been published in Russian, for it appeared in 1909, when reaction was at its height in our country. This pamphlet is a big step forward since it does not deal with the revolutionary program in general, as the pamphlet of 1899 against Bernstein, or with the tasks of the social revolution, irrespective of the time of its occurrence, as the 1902 pamphlet, The Social Revolution. It deals with the concrete conditions which compels us to recognize that the era of revolutions is setting in. The author explicitly points to the aggravation of class antagonisms in general, and to imperialism, which plays a particularly important part in this respect. After the revolutionary period of 1789 to 1871 in Western Europe, he says, a similar period began in the East in 1905. A world war is approaching with menacing rapidity. Quote, it, the proletariat, can no longer talk of premature revolution. Quote, we have entered a revolutionary period. The, quote, revolutionary era is beginning, unquote. These statements are perfectly clear. This pamphlet of Kautsky's should serve as a measure of comparison of what the German Social Democrats promised to be before the imperialist war and the depth of degradation to which they, including Kautsky himself, sank when the war broke out. Quote, the present situation, Kautsky wrote in the pamphlet under survey, quote, is fraught with the danger that we, i.e. the German Social Democrats, may easily appear to be more moderate than we really are, unquote. It turned out that in reality the German Social Democratic Party was much more moderate and opportunist than it appeared to be. It is all the more characteristic, therefore, that although Kautsky so explicitly declared that the era of revolution had already begun, in the pamphlet which he himself said was devoted to an analysis of the political revolution, he again completely avoided the question of the state. These evasions of the question, these omissions and equivocations, inevitably added up to that complete swing over to opportunism with which we shall now have to deal. Kautsky, the German Social Democrats' spokesman, seems to have declared, "I abide by revolutionary views," 1899. "I recognize, above all, the inevitability of the social revolution of the proletariat," 1902. "I recognize the advent of a new era of revolutions," 1909. Still, I am going back on what Marx said as early as 1852, since the question of the tasks of the proletarian revolution in relation to the state is being raised, 1912. It was in this point-blank form that the question was put in Kautsky's controversy with Pannekoek. Section 3. Kautsky's controversy with Pannekoek. In opposing Kautsky, Pannekoek came out as one of the representatives of the, quote, left radical trend, which included Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Radek, and others. Advocating revolutionary tactics, they were united in the conviction that Kautsky was going over to the center, which wavered in an unprincipled manner between Marxism and opportunism. Quick comment, I don't know that opportunism has ever been defined in this. Probably, if you're reading this by now, you're familiar with the Marxist understanding of opportunism. Opportunism is when you work with people who you have a fundamental conflict with, i.e. the proletariat working with the bourgeoisie. There's a fundamental conflict of interest. The opposite of this is sectarianism, which is when you refuse to work with people with whom you do not have a fundamental conflict. Okay, continuing. This view was proved perfectly correct by the war, when this centrist, wrongly called Marxist trend, aka Kautskyism, revealed itself in all its repulsive wretchedness. In an article touching on the question of the state, entitled Mass Action and Revolution, Neue Zeit, 1912, volume 30, Pannekoek described Kautsky's attitude as one of passive radicalism, as a theory of inactive expectancy. Kautsky refuses to see the process of revolution, wrote Pannekoek. In presenting the matter in this way, Pannekoek approached the subject which interests us, namely, the tasks of the proletarian revolution in regard to the state. Quote, "The struggle of the proletariat," he wrote, "is not merely a struggle against the bourgeoisie for state power, but a struggle against state power. The content of this, the proletarian revolution, is the destruction and dissolution of the instruments of power of the state with the aid of the instruments of power of the proletariat." Quoting again, "The struggle will cease only when, as the result of it, the state organization is completely destroyed. The organization of the majority will then have demonstrated its superiority by destroying the organization of the ruling minority," unquote. The formulation in which Pannekoek presented his ideas suffers from serious defects, but its meaning is clear nonetheless, and it is interesting to note how Kautsky combated it. Quote, "Up to now," he wrote, "the antithesis between the Social Democrats and the anarchists has been that the former wished to win the state power while the latter wished to destroy it. Pannekoek wants to do both," unquote. Although Pannekoek's exposition lacks precision and concreteness, not to speak of other shortcomings of his article which have no bearing on the present subject, Kautsky seized precisely on the point of principle raised by Pannekoek, and on this fundamental point of principle, Kautsky completely abandoned the Marxist position and went over wholly to opportunism. His definition of the distinction between the Social Democrats and the anarchists is completely wrong. He completely vulgarizes and distorts Marxism. The distinction between Marxists and the anarchists is this. 1. The former, while aiming at the complete abolition of the state, recognize that this aim can only be achieved after classes have been abolished by the socialist revolution, as the result of the establishment of socialism, which leads to the withering away of the state. The latter want to abolish the state completely overnight, not understanding the conditions under which the state can be abolished. 2. The former recognize that after the proletariat has won political power, it must completely destroy the old state machine and replace it by a new one consisting of an organization of the armed workers after the type of the commune. The latter, while insisting on the destruction of the state machine, have a very vague idea of what the proletariat will put in its place and how it will use its revolutionary power. The anarchists even deny that the revolutionary proletariat should use the state power. They reject its revolutionary dictatorship. 3. The former demand that the proletariat be trained for revolution by utilizing the present state. The anarchists reject this. In this controversy, it is not Kautsky but Pannekoek who represents Marxism, for it was Marx who taught that the proletariat cannot simply win state power, in the sense that the old state apparatus passes into new hands, but must smash this apparatus, must break it, and replace it with a new one. Kautsky abandons Marxism for the opportunist camp, for this destruction of the state machine, which is utterly unacceptable to the opportunists, completely disappears from his argument, and he leaves a loophole for them in that conquest may be interpreted as the simple acquisition of a majority. To cover up his distortion of Marxism, Kautsky behaves like a doctrinaire. He puts forward a quotation from Marx himself. In 1850, Marx wrote that, quote, "a resolute centralization of power in the hands of the state authority," unquote, was necessary. And Kautsky triumphantly asks, does Pannekoek want to destroy centralism? This is simply a trick, like Bernstein's identification of the views of Marxism and Proudhonism on the subject of federalism as against centralism. Kautsky's quotation is neither here nor there. Centralism is possible with both the old and the new state machine. If the workers voluntarily unite their armed forces, this will be centralism, but it will be based on the complete destruction of the centralized state apparatus, the standing army, the police, and the bureaucracy. Kautsky acts like an outright swindler by evading the perfectly well-known arguments of Marx and Engels on the Commune and plucking out a quotation which has nothing to do with the point at issue. Quote, "Perhaps he," meaning Pannekoek, Kautsky continues, "wants to abolish the state functions of the officials, but we cannot do without officials even in the party and trade unions, let alone in the state administration. And our program does not demand the abolition of state officials, but that they be elected by the people. We are discussing here not the form the administrative apparatus of the future state will assume, but whether our political struggle abolishes the state power before we have captured it. Which ministry with its officials could be abolished?" Unquote. Then follows an enumeration of the ministries of education, justice, finance, and war. Quote, "No, not one of the present ministries will be removed by our political struggle against the government. I repeat, in order to prevent misunderstanding, we are not discussing here the form the future state will be given by the victorious Social Democrats, but how the present state is changed by our opposition." Unquote. This is an obvious trick. Pannekoek raised the question of revolution. Both the title of his article and the passages quoted above clearly indicate this. By skipping to the question of opposition, Kautsky substitutes the opportunist for the revolutionary point of view. What he says means, at present we are in opposition. What we shall be after we have captured power, that we shall see. Revolution has vanished, and that is exactly what the opportunists wanted. The point at issue is neither opposition nor political struggle in general, but revolution. Revolution consists in the proletariat destroying the administrative apparatus and the whole state machine, replacing it with a new one made up of the armed workers. Kautsky displays a superstitious reverence for ministries, but why can they not be replaced, say, by committees of specialists working under sovereign, all-powerful Soviets of workers and soldiers' deputies? The point is not at all whether the ministries will remain, or whether committees of specialists or some other bodies will be set up. That is quite immaterial. The point is whether the old state machine, bound by thousands of threads to the bourgeoisie and permeated through and through with routine and inertia, shall remain, or be destroyed and replaced with a new one. Revolution consists not in the new class commanding, governing with the aid of the old state machine, but in this class smashing this machine and commanding, governing with the aid of a new machine. Kautsky slurs over this basic idea of Marxism, or he does not understand it at all. His question about officials clearly shows that he does not understand the lesson of the Commune or the teachings of Marx. Quote, "We cannot do without officials even in the party and the trade unions." Unquote. We cannot do without officials under capitalism, under the rule of the bourgeoisie. The proletariat is oppressed. The working people are enslaved by capitalism. Under capitalism, democracy is restricted, cramped, curtailed, mutilated by all the conditions of wage slavery and the poverty and misery of the people. This and this alone is why the functionaries of our political organizations and trade unions are corrupted, or rather tend to be corrupted, by the conditions of capitalism and betray a tendency to become bureaucrats, i.e. privileged persons divorced from the people and standing above the people. That is the essence of bureaucracy, and until the capitalists have been expropriated and the bourgeoisie overthrown, even proletarian functionaries will inevitably be bureaucratized to a certain extent. According to Kautsky, since elected functionaries will remain under socialism, so will officials, so will the bureaucracy. This is exactly where he is wrong. Marx, referring to the example of the Commune, showed that under socialism, functionaries will cease to be bureaucrats, to be officials. They will cease to be so in proportion as, in addition to the principle of election of officials, the principle of recall at any time is also introduced, as salaries are reduced to the level of the wages of the average workman, and as parliamentary institutions are replaced by working bodies, executive and legislative, at the same time. Quick comment, the concept of reducing the salaries to the levels of the wages of the average working person, it's a hugely popular concept in the United States, possibly a talking point worth adopting when convincing people of the merits of the socialist program. Continuing. As a matter of fact, the whole of Kautsky's argument against Pannekoek, and particularly the former's wonderful point that we cannot do without officials even in our party and trade union organizations, is merely a repetition of Bernstein's old, quote, arguments against Marxism in general. In his renegade book, The Premises of Socialism, Bernstein combats the ideas of, quote, primitive democracy, combats what he calls, quote, doctrinaire democracy, binding mandates, unpaid officials, impotent central representative bodies, etc. To prove that this primitive democracy is unsound, Bernstein refers to the experience of the British trade unions, as interpreted by the Webbs. 70 years of development, quote, in absolute freedom, he says, convinced the trade unions that primitive democracy was useless, and they replaced it by ordinary democracy, i.e. parliamentarism combined with bureaucracy. In reality, the trade unions did not develop, quote, in absolute freedom, but in absolute capitalist slavery. Comment, yeah. Under which, it goes without saying, a number of concessions to the prevailing evil, violence, falsehood, exclusion of the poor from the affairs of higher administration, quote, cannot be done without. Under socialism, much of, quote, primitive democracy will inevitably be revived, since, for the first time in the history of civilized society, the massive population will rise to taking an independent part, not only in voting and elections, but also in the everyday administration of the state. Under socialism, all will govern in turn, and will soon become accustomed to no one governing. Marx's critico-analytical genius saw in the practical measures of the Commune the turning point which the opportunists fear and do not want to recognize because of their cowardice, because they do not want to break irrevocably with the bourgeoisie, and which the anarchists do not want to see, either because they are in a hurry, or because they do not understand at all the conditions of great social changes. Quote, we must not even think of destroying the old state machine. How can we do without ministries and officials? Argues the opportunist, who is completely saturated with Philistinism, and who, at bottom, not only does not believe in revolution, in the creative power of revolution, but lives in mortal dread of it, like our Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries. Quote, we must think only of destroying the old state machine. It is no use probing into the concrete lessons of earlier proletarian revolutions and analyzing what to put in the place of what has been destroyed and how, unquote, argues the anarchist, the best of the anarchist, of course, and not those who, following the Kropotkins and company, trail behind the bourgeoisie. Consequently, the tactics of the anarchist become the tactics of despair, instead of a ruthlessly bold revolutionary effort to solve concrete problems while taking into account the practical conditions of the mass movement. Marx teaches us to avoid both errors. He teaches us to act with supreme boldness in destroying the entire old state machine, And at the same time, he teaches us to put the question concretely. The Commune was able, in the space of a few weeks, to start building a new proletarian state machine by introducing such and such measures to provide wider democracy and to uproot bureaucracy. Let us learn revolutionary boldness from the communards. Let us see in their practical measures the outline of really urgent and immediately possible measures. And then, following this road, we shall achieve the complete destruction of bureaucracy. The possibility of this destruction is guaranteed by the fact that socialism will shorten the working day, will raise people to a new life, will create such conditions for the majority of the population as will enable everybody, without exception, to perform, quote, state functions. And this will lead to the complete withering away of every form of state in general. Quote, its object, the object of the mass strike, Kautsky continues, quote, cannot be to destroy the state power. Its only object can be to make the government compliant on some specific question or to replace a government hostile to the proletariat by one willing to meet it halfway. But never, under no circumstances, can it, that is, the proletarian victory over a hostile government, lead to the destruction of state power. It can lead only to a certain shifting of the balance of forces within the state power. The aim of our political struggle remains, as in the past, the conquest of state power by winning a majority in Parliament and by raising Parliament to the ranks of the master of the government. Unquote. This is nothing but the purest and most vulgar opportunism, repudiating revolution in deeds while accepting it in words. Kautsky's thoughts go no further than a, quote, government willing to meet the proletariat halfway. It's a step backwards to Philistinism compared with 1847, when the Communist Manifesto proclaimed, quote, the organization of the proletariat as the ruling class. Quick comment, I was pretty stunned there. Some of those pauses were, I just trying to fully process and absorb that Kautsky quote. That was crazy. Continuing. Kautsky will have to achieve his beloved unity with the Scheidmans, Plekhanovs, and Vandervelds, all of whom agree to fight for a government, quote, willing to meet the proletariat halfway. We, however, shall break with these traitors to socialism, and we shall fight for the complete destruction of the old state machine, in order that the armed proletariat itself may become the government. These are two vastly different things. Kautsky will have to enjoy the pleasant company of the Legines and Davids, Plekhanovs, Patrusovs, Tseretellis, and Chernovs, who are quite willing to work for, quote, shifting the balance of forces within the state power, for, quote, winning a majority in Parliament, and raising Parliament to the ranks of master of the government. A most worthy object, which is wholly acceptable to the opportunists, and which keeps everything within the bounds of the bourgeois parliamentary republic. We, however, shall break with the opportunists, and the entire class-conscious proletariat will be with us in the fight, not to shift the balance of forces, but to overthrow the bourgeoisie, to destroy bourgeois parliamentarism, for a democratic republic after the type of the Commune, or a republic of Soviets of workers' and soldiers' deputies, for the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. To the right of Kautsky in international socialism, there are trends such as Socialist Monthly in Germany, Legine, David, Kolb, and many others, including the Scandinavian Stauning and Bronting, Jaurès followers in Vandervelde in France and Belgium, Thierry, Trev, and other right-wingers of the Italian Party, Fabians and Independents, the Independent Labour Party, which in fact has always been dependent on the Liberals in Britain, and the like. All these gentry, who play a tremendous, very often a predominant role in the parliamentary work and the press of their parties, repudiate outright the dictatorship of the proletariat and pursue a policy of undisguised opportunism. In the eyes of these gentry, the dictatorship of the proletariat contradicts democracy. There is really no essential distinction between them and the petty bourgeois Democrats. Taking this circumstance into consideration, we are justified in drawing the conclusion that the Second International, that is, the overwhelming majority of its official representatives, has completely sunk into opportunism. The experience of the commune has been not only ignored, but distorted. Far from inculcating in workers' minds the idea that the time is nearing when they must act to smash the old state machine, replace it by a new one, and in this way make their political rule the foundation for the socialist reorganization of society, they have actually preached to the masses the very opposite, and have depicted the conquest of power in a way that has left thousands of loopholes for opportunism. The distortion and hushing up of the question of the relation of the proletarian revolution to the state could not but play an immense role at a time when states, which possess a military apparatus, expanded as a consequence of imperialist rivalry, have become military monsters which are exterminating millions of people in order to settle the issue as to whether Britain or Germany, this or that finance capital, is to rule the world. That's the end of section 6, and the manuscript continues as follows. Chapter 7, the experience of the Russian revolutions of 1905 and 1917. The subject indicated in the title of this chapter is so vast that volumes could be written about it. In the present pamphlet, we shall have to confine ourselves, naturally, to the most important lessons provided by experience, those bearing directly upon the tasks of the proletariat in the revolution with regard to state power. And the editor has noted that here, the manuscript breaks off. There's also a quick postscript to the first edition. I'll read that. It's really just a paragraph. This pamphlet was written in August and September 1917. I had already drawn up the plan for the next, 7th chapter, the experience of the Russian revolutions of 1905 and 1917. Apart from the title, however, I had no time to write a single line of the chapter. I was interrupted by a political crisis, the eve of the October Revolution of 1917. Such an interruption can only be welcomed, but the writing of this second part of the pamphlet, the experience of the Russian revolutions of 1905 and 1917, will probably have to be put off for a long time. It is more pleasant and useful to go through the experience of revolution than to write about it. The author, Petrograd, November 30, 1917. There are also a couple of pages of footnotes, commenting now, that you can check out if you want to get the actual text of this, which I will link to in the video description. Otherwise, that is the end of The State and Revolution by Lenin from 1917. For my money at this point in time, if I were to refer someone to a single document by Lenin, or possibly by any socialist, I think I might actually point them towards this one and say, read this through and make a list of your questions. Because I feel like this document addresses the vast majority of the most frequently asked questions that I hear in recent years, that I've heard, whether running the Facebook page or YouTube, like whatever. These are the questions that I feel like people are most likely to ask and be wondering about. This is what causes people to be hesitant in deciding whether they're a socialist or not. It's exactly these kinds of questions. I feel like if people were to start if people weren't ready to make a commitment to studying, this of course is in the basic Marxism-Leninism study course, and it's preceded by 6 other texts, which, that sort of presumes that you're committed to reading all 20-something of them. But if somebody was not willing to make that commitment, they're like, I'll read 1 or 2 things and that's it, I would probably point them to this first and say, read this and make a list of your questions. And then whatever questions you have after reading this, in other words, that weren't answered by reading this text itself, because I feel like it's going to answer many of them and introduce the logic of, a lot of what people are going to be thinking about. If you were to start with that, you're probably going to start from, with a lot of the common confusion cleared up. So anyway, that's about the end of this for me. I really just had one other comment. So what Lenin ends section 6, which is really the last complete chapter, by saying, I'm going to read it again. The distortion and hushing up of the question of the relation of the proletarian revolution to the state could not but play an immense role at a time when states, which possess a military apparatus, expanded as a consequence of imperialist rivalry, have become military monsters which are exterminating millions of people in order to settle the issue of basically capitalist rivalry. So we have a situation that is, basically 100 years on, 100 and change years on from when Lenin wrote that. And that situation is only, more advanced. Those military bureaucracies, the military-industrial complex is only more consolidated, more destructive. I mean, they didn't have nuclear weapons at this point in time. And most of it is centered in the United States. Of course, some of the other imperialist powers have nuclear weapons as well and, maintain armies still. Primarily, it's the U.S. that does the heavy lifting. And I made the comment earlier in this document that it might take the entire world to put that down. So what do? Lenin here has laid out very clear principles, very clear roadmap, I think with very sound reasoning on the whole. And of course, combined with other theoretical and historical texts, it just becomes that much clearer. But basically, the imperative of revolution is clear, although revolutionary situations are not always present. His question here is, when you have a revolutionary situation, who balks, who's afraid of it, who organizes their politics around that fear, and who embraces it and strives towards it and eagerly embraces it when it arises? Well, those are the questions for with whom we form our alliances as socialists, what standards we hold ourselves and other socialists to, as we work to foment and then take advantage of revolutionary situations as they arise. I've given my opinion that the US might be the last place in the world where that kind of revolutionary situation arises, but history's full of surprises, and I want to make that absolutely clear that I count nothing out. We saw a lot of unrest last year in 2020. We might continue to see unrest pop up in seemingly unlikely places. As socialists, I think we have to always be on the watch and always be working toward a situation where we can do exactly what Lenin is describing here. With that, I'm going to sign off and thank the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month. And, or if donations aren't your thing, sharing the videos absolutely helps. Remember to like, subscribe, and share. Whether you're on Twitter, we are now on Twitter, so you can find our account, retweet our posts, boost it that way, or you can share it into spaces where we haven't already shared it, your Discord servers and other spaces online. Facebook right now. We're no longer on Facebook, so if you're in left-wing Facebook groups, share our videos. That's a huge help. You can reach hundreds or even thousands of people with a single click by sharing it who have already declared that they're interested in socialism. And finally, leave a comment, because A, it boosts the video in the YouTube algorithm, and B, we like to have a discussion. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you in the next video.
Politicians and civil servants to run this.
The reason that we are revolutionaries, it's not because we want to choose to make a revolution to overthrow capitalism, but we feel that in order to get to socialism and in order to save humanity, it's an absolute necessary thing to do. There's no other way to solve the problem than to overthrow capitalism. Now, Marx wrote Capital, the 3 volumes, right? And when he wrote this, it was his final and most, important theoretical work that he had produced. It was really the culmination of a lifetime of theoretical work he did on trying to explain how capitalism works, how it arose, and why it inevitably will fall. Now, of course, some of these ideas, they culminated in Capital, but some of these ideas he had on a preliminary basis early on. Like, for example, he mentions in Capital that capitalism, in trying to establish itself as the predominant system of the world, was able to smash through all obstacles in its way. But he also pointed out that the only obstacles that capitalism couldn't overcome, couldn't smash, are the obstacles that it put in its own way as a byproduct of the system. And you get a gist of this as early as 1848 in the Communist Manifesto, the famous quote, which I'm going to read now, where Marx and Engels write, "The conditions of bourgeois society are too narrow to comprise the wealth created by them." And how does the bourgeoisie get over these crises? On the one hand, by enforced destruction of a mass of productive forces. On the other, by the conquest of new markets and by the more thorough exploitation of the old ones. That is to say, by paving the way for more extensive and more destructive crises, and by diminishing the means whereby crises are prevented. The weapons with which the bourgeoisie felled feudalism to the ground are now turned against the bourgeoisie itself. So these ideas were already in Marx's mind and developed in a more thorough way over his career. So it's our task to study Marx's writings, to understand capitalism, see why the downfall of the system is inevitable, and also understand that there is nothing the ruling class can do to fix it. There's nothing the ruling class can do to make capitalism a more humane, a nicer system. This doesn't mean, by the way, that the victory of the working...
Same time tomorrow. We'll continue with this podcast, How Does Capitalism Work?